Hi, Joe Clark with Inventus Eurotherm. Today we're going to be doing the second part of the review Lite instructional video. If you guys remember from the first video, we really just kind of did a real basic introduction to review, creating a chart, talked about a couple different items, but we didn't really get too in-depth with it, so that's what this video is going to be covering. Hopefully it might clarify some questions, answer some of the questions you had. And again, we're not going to get into every particular detail, but we're going to hit the majority of the options within review and just kind of show you around some of the menu structure. So as you guys should be familiar with now, we have the review program open. And I guess really the first thing to look at is the upper left-hand corner. We got a couple of menus going across here: File, View, Instrument, Security, Options, and Help. So we're going to go ahead and start with File and kind of go through all the different options you have within each menu. Now keep in mind, anything that's grayed within the menu structure is a review full feature, and we're not going to be talking about that. So keep that in mind. That's why we're skipping over it. And sometime in the near future, I'll be doing a instructional video on review full. So that being said, let's go ahead and create a chart like we did in the last video. So I'm not going to talk too much about actually creating a chart since we've already done that. But so I'm about to create my chart, but there's a couple things we didn't talk about in the last video. In particular, if you look towards the bottom of the screen here, you've got chart setup. Right now you have three different check boxes. One of them is checked. The show messages. Show messages simply indicates when you create that chart, do you want the messages to be shown? Those messages could be a user logging in, an alarm going off, or your batch information in particular. So if you want them shown, leave it checked. If not, uncheck it. Keep traces clear of timestamps. Simply refers to any of the messages. If it happens to occur on a specific timestamp, it will put it to the right of the timestamp so that it doesn't overlap it. Same kind of concept when you have multiple messages occurring at one time. Instead of stacking one message on top of the other, they come directly to the right, or which it would be looking like directly below it. Your major divisions and minor divisions, 10 and 1. If you want to change them, add or subtract lines from your chart, you can do it here. Show time zones on chart. That's just saying it's going to indicate the time zone in addition to the regular time on the chart. What you see in front of you right now, this is all default, so 9 times out of 10, that's going to be more than sufficient for you, but if you want to change it, feel free to. A couple things I want to point out towards the bottom here. Edit point. If you want to basically add or subtract, more or less add points, you can do it this way and make a modification to it. But what I want to point out is this button down here called Point Properties. When you click on Point Properties, it brings up the box, and all the items within this box pertain to that specific point. So right now you see that we've got Test TC selected. That's based on our chart setup. And a couple things that we're looking at right now. Span low, span high. That is information that's picked up from the recorder data. So the recorder was set up for span low and high of 250 and 2300. If you want to change them, feel free to, but it's really not necessary. Maybe if you want to zoom in a little bit more and not show the full range, that's where you can do it. The zone low and zone high refer to segmenting the chart into smaller charts. For an example, right now zone low and high is 0 to 100%, so it's going to use the entire scale of the chart. But let's just say that you've got two I/O points and you want to split that in halves because they're very similar in temperature and you don't want them overlapping. So if you had, let's say, thermocouple 7 as your first input and thermocouple 8 as your second, you could set up thermocouple 7 as a zone low of 0 and a zone high of 50 to take up half the chart, and then thermocouple 8 could be 51 to 100. And basically that's just splitting the chart into two so that you can have more or less two charts fitting into one. Trace mode, this is kind of a unique feature to it. Normal and interpolation off is going to be the default, and that is simply your default view. That means that at every specific interval you're going to see what that reading was at that interval. However, if you turn the interpolation on, in between readings, it's going to take the reading of the last previous reading and the next previous reading, and it's going to make it linear in between those points. Now, a normal view, you may not even notice anything. This really comes into play when you're zooming in into more of the chart and getting really, in between points, less than a second interval. You may have a gap of a second where it's reading the same temperature, but if you turn the interpolation, excuse me, on, it will add points in between there to give it more of a linear feel. Average is designed so that if you are zooming out of the chart, let's just say that instead of looking at 1 second intervals, we're now looking at 10-second intervals. So we have a much larger scale of data we're looking at. It's based on the pixel, so the line on the screen is obviously going to be bigger than the amount of time that it's accounting for. So when you do an average, that's going to say it's going to take the amount of points that happen during that pixel. For example, if you're zoomed in at 1 second interval, a pixel might be 1 point of data, one data read. But if you zoom out for 10 points, that may be 2 or 4 or 5 points of I/O. So what it's going to do is take all those reads and average them together. The minimum, maximum, pretty self-explanatory. It's going to take the min or the max read during that time. Again, you're really not going to notice much of a difference unless you're extremely zoomed in or extremely zoomed out. I'll try to briefly touch on this towards the end of the presentation to kind of show you what I'm talking about. And lastly, the color. Again, it's going to be picking up the color from the recorder based on how you have it set up in the recorder. But if you want to change it to something else, I believe you have over 50 different colors to choose from, and feel free to choose whatever colors you want to use. And that's pretty much it. Then, of course, as we talked about before, once you hit OK, it creates the chart for you. That being said, we'll get into a little bit more of the chart functionality a little bit later on. Let's keep going through the rest of the menus, though. So let's go ahead and downsize this guy. All right, back underneath the file, open chart. Again, we talked about that before. If you save a chart, you can always open it at a later time. It's the same as double-clicking the icon that it creates for you. Close chart, save chart, and save chart as. Very common functionality there. Close chart, obviously, you're closing the chart if you want to save it and save it as a specific name. You can choose one of these two items as well. And again, this is going to be identical to doing any of these icons here, which we'll talk about shortly. But for the most part, all these icons are going to relate to specific items in the menu. Okay, so we've got transfer. We've got a couple different options for transfer. The first option is files. When you do files, that's basically saying I have individual files that I want to pull into my review database. This is ideal if you have maybe 1, 2, or 3 different UHH files, which are the NanoDeck and the recorders encrypted files. If you're pulling in 1 or 2 or 3 files, that's ideal. However, if you're not and you have multiple files located within a folder, then it's probably more ideal for you to choose from folders. And when you do this, you actually choose a folder, and within that folder, it's going to take everything that it can find and store it in the database. What's more common, however, is you do the transfer then from removable media. In the event that your recorder or your NanoDeck is not on the network, the only way you're going to be able to get the data off the recorder is by putting it on some kind of USB stick drive. So what you would do is input up to an 8 gig USB stick, do an archive, and bring it over to your computer. With the device plugged into your computer, simply pick the USB stick and hit OK, and then it will simply do a transfer of all the files to your database. Very simple, very easy process. And of course, schedule transfer is a full function, so we won't talk about that. Underneath database, a couple different items here. You have the option to select different databases. You may have a different database for a specific recorder, different database for an application, whatever it may be. Selecting database allows you to choose between different databases. Likewise, if you want to create a new database, this gives you the option to choose a new database. Keep in mind that whenever you choose a different database or a new database, if you want it to be your default database, you need to make sure that you have it set to default database. If you don't, you close out a review. Next time you open it, it will revert back to the last known default database. So keep that in mind. Database properties simply talks about your current database, tells you where the location is, the current size, the maximum size of 2 gigabytes, which is a Microsoft Access database property, and it also lets you know if it's the default database or not. Maintain database. Now we just talked about the 2 GB limit. Because it is a Microsoft Access database, there is a physical limitation to the database. This becomes a problem when you have multiple recorders with multiple I/O points over a long period of time, all being archived into one database. So in the event that your database is growing in size too much, or you have data that's irrelevant, Maintain Database serves as a perfect means of basically cleaning up the database and getting rid of or moving the data as you see necessary. Simply click on the recorder and the group, and whatever batch files or UHH data you see within the box, and you have the ability to move it to an existing archive. You can move it to a new archive, or if you just want to delete it, simply hit delete. Once you're done, all you've got to do is hit close. It's going to ask you to compact the database, and depending on how much you actually delete and the size of it in the first place, it could take anywhere from maybe as short as a minute to maybe as long as 5 to 7 minutes to do. Export basically gives you the ability to take what you currently have on your chart, which is downsized in the very bottom left hand corner, but this allows you to essentially take that file and export it to some other means, like a CSV file, which we'll talk about here shortly. Print also gives you the ability to take what you're currently looking at and print it off to a paper copy if that's what's needed. And we'll talk about that here very shortly as well. Underneath edit, that is pretty much for the most part relevant to what we have going on right now. That's based on the chart. Underneath view, you have toolbar, status bar, and log window. These are all items that are shown. Toolbar and status bar are by default, and you can see as we remove them, the bar at the very bottom will disappear, as well as the bar at the very top. Simply re-click to enable them, and they'll be shown. Okay, underneath instrument, file services. This gives you the ability to connect to individual recorders and actually see what data is on the recorder as we speak. It's like an FTP connection. It allows you to transfer over the files manually, one by one if you like. Does not allow you to delete it. So this is kind of a nice way to just connect to it live and transfer individual files. Log off. If you log on to the system, every time you connect and review and you have a recorder that is on the network, it would log on to the recorder. If for some reason you don't want to be logged on anymore, simply clicking log off will log you off the recorder. Now, auto backup and transfer is something we talked about in the last video, so I'm not going to go into too much depth about this. I just want to point out that running as a service is a big function of the review full program. And when you have that checked, it allows review to run in the background without even having the program open, and it automatically pulls the data at whatever interval you set at the very bottom down here. Setup, TCP/IP. Again, if your recorders or NanoDAC are on a network, instead of manually archiving the data from a USB stick, you can use Review to go out to each individual recorder and pull the data in to its Review database. This is the first step, obviously, in transferring the data. It's very simple. All you need to do is input the IP address, give it a unique identifier, and hit OK. And once that's done, all the instruments you have set up will be shown in your auto backup and transfer, as you see on the left-hand side. Okay, chart. The chart window will pull up, will be available once you have a chart available. And so let's go ahead and go through a couple of these quick settings. So the setup window is the exact same window we just saw previously. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but it allows you to go in and make changes as necessary. Go to. This is a nice function. This is actually a really important function to the review program because this allows you to search for individual data. More importantly, your batch data. So as we talked about in the last video, if we want to look for a specific batch, we can either click on this icon right here, which is a little clock, or go to the chart and go to. By clicking on the batch button and looking for the batch name, once we hit OK, it loads the data referring specifically to the batch. And as we did in the last video, you can see it's a 3 set point survey that's being shown here with all the messages. And again, as I mentioned before, if we don't want to show the messages, simply go back in to the chart setup and either enable or disable. Another nice feature that you have is we go back into go to. If you want to look for a specific date and time, for example, let's look at all the data starting at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and we want to go for 4 hours from that date. We don't care about anything before or after, we just are concerned about that data in particular. When we hit OK, as you can see, it's going to then modify the chart by zooming into 1600, which is your 4 o'clock, and ending 4 hours later. Really what it's doing is it's modifying your view. If we were to increase the size of the chart, obviously you see we have beyond that time period. But what's nice about this is that when you have it set up like this, you can look for specific data, and data that's irrelevant is basically blocked out of it. But more importantly, if you wanted to just print this specific data, as we talked about before, by going to File, Print, or by hitting the print icon, we can then just say we want to print the current view. And by doing that, now we're going to be able to print just the 4 hours worth of data and nothing else, nothing more. Just to kind of give you an idea of some of the options you have. If we want to print the current view, which we have on the screen there, we leave the current view button selected. A couple different things you can add to the layout of the chart if you want to add something to it. This gives you the preview before you print, and again, this is exactly what it will look like when it prints. So as you can see, we've got the chart, we've got our 4 hours worth of data, we've got our thermocouples, their colors and their names on the left hand side, our caption, how we chosen to do the batch, also our batch name would be indicated as well. And from here, if you wanted to, you can just do a print function and send that to your printer. Same thing as what we had in the go to function, you can also print by batch. Or if you want to do something otherwise, as we did previously, you can select a specific interval of time. And then of course on the right hand side it's going to ask you what exactly you want to print. You can print it in portrait or landscape orientation, and then also your messages. Annotate's a nice feature. This allows you to add a note to the chart, and once you add that note to the chart, it is within the chart and it cannot be deleted. So this serves as a good, almost like a check type tool. What some customers may do is if they have a process where an engineer will print off their batch data and then they have to have another engineer review, they will do it this way, whereas the engineer that's reviewing the data will open up their the chart, look at the data, and then will verify that it's been verified by Joe. When you do this, which I will not, this will be printed onto the chart based on the annotation timestamp, and it will give the login credentials of the computer. So again, what we'll talk about here very shortly with Security Manager, if you're utilizing Security Manager, you could have individual logins, and that way you can prove who was logged in, who verified it, and at what time. Next, underneath Security, everything is grayed out. Again, this refers to the Security Manager option. Security Manager is a feature both in the 6100 series recorder as well as review. And what it does is it utilizes the Microsoft Access Directory, Microsoft Active Directory, and basically it's a way of letting the IT department manage user logins and their credentials. And with that being said, it's ideal for recorders because if you have multiple recorders, you can deploy usernames and passwords across the network, the plant. Same with review. If you want to have a specific user logged out, or have restricted access to doing certain things within review, like creating charts or deleting charts, Security Manager plays a big part into that. Underneath options and fonts, you can go into here and change individual fonts of the chart. Master Archive folder allows you to change where the Master Archive folder is located. The Master Archive folder is the folder used for backing up all the files from your recorder or your NanoDAC. The default is placed within the program data directory, which is a hidden file in Windows 7. However, if you decide at a later time that you want to put your Master Archive folder on a centralized location, so like a network drive, for example, this is where you would go about changing that location. And again, if you're running multiple copies of review and you want to utilize one central place, I would highly recommend putting the Master Archive folder and the database on one centralized location so everything is synced. Settings more or less talk about what we've already covered previously, but this is the default setting. So anything we make changes here, next time we create a chart, next time we want to do something else in review, whatever we put within this setup is what the default will be. We've already talked about default trace mode. The default chart mode, we have chart and spreadsheet. Again, spreadsheet is currently grayed out, meaning that you do not have the ability to create spreadsheets in Review Full. However, what I will talk about here shortly is that you can actually export the chart data to a CSV spreadsheet. So it's kind of you can't create something live, but you can create a spreadsheet after the fact. This also goes for your sample interval, what is displayed on the spreadsheet, as well as information pertaining to your CSV data. Again, I would recommend leaving this as is. If you ever need to make a change, you can make it on the fly. And what I've noticed is that these default settings apply to most customers. There's really not a need to change it. And lastly, if you wanted to enable some of the Review Full features, simply clicking on the Enable Review Full will allow Review Full to run in 30-minute intervals. So keep that in mind. If you want to test it, feel free to do it here. Window, this all pertains to the actual chart itself or the screen. So if you want to tile it, if you want to cascade or create a new one, this is where you can do it. And lastly, underneath the Help menu, we've got the Help window, the Help topics. This is actually surprisingly very helpful. It's one of the more useful help files that we have. You have a question to review, I would highly recommend taking a quick look at the Review Full and just going through or doing a search on something within Review. If you don't have any idea of how something functions or you don't understand the way that it works, going in here will do a pretty good job of explaining what it is. And then of course underneath the About Review will simply tell you if you are running a Lite or full version and what version of Review you are running. So that was pretty much all the menus. Quickly going through them, there was a couple of things I did skip over, but they're for the most part irrelevant. These icons directly below it, as I mentioned before, pretty much tie into any of these sub-menus above. Now, with the chart open, one of the last features that I wanted to show you was the export capability. So, in the event that you are running Review Lite, you can't create a spreadsheet within Review unless you export it. Now, our recorders and NanoDACs will, within the hardware, create a CSV data for you if you'd like. But let's just say that you don't have them set up that way, and the only way you can look at the data remotely is by bringing it into Review. We have a chart up on our screen right now, and let's just say that we want to take what we have on our screen and export it to a spreadsheet. Once a chart is created, if you go to File and down to Export, you have a window that's very, very similar to that of the Print window as well as the Go To window. So once you get familiar with this format, it makes doing all these functions extremely easy. So for example, let's take what we're looking at the screen in particular. We'll choose Current View, meaning that whatever I have on my screen is what it's going to print. From there, I've got a couple other items, for example, the layout. If you wanted to have the date time in the text string or spreadsheet numeric format. And then, of course, the separator, are you going to have it in a tab or default separator? My recommendation, leave them as is. It's the most organized view in terms of spreadsheet data. What I'd recommend doing next, once you go through and choose what options you want, if you hit copy to file, you can save it on your desktop as anything. We'll just label this example, for example. And we notice that we won't give it an extension, and I'll discuss why we're not doing this. So I created a file called example, put it on my desktop, and here we go. Now we've got a file called example. It's a blank file with no extension. And what we're going to do is, now that we've got Excel open, once we take this file, drag it over into Excel, it's going to come up with a little warning message. And we do a real quick format. You see, now we're looking at the spreadsheet data within Excel. The reason why I don't give it an extension is because different versions of Excel use different extensions. What's ideal is to not give it an extension, drag the file into Excel, and then once you're done making any kind of modifications, font changes, deletions of specific cells, then you can go in and save it. Save it as a text type or as any other kind of format that you want to. That way you have a little bit more functionality and really kind of determine the way you want your spreadsheet to look. And as you can see here, this is going to be very similar to the information that I had printed earlier in review. But now it's just in spreadsheet form. So we've got the messages, we've got our 6 thermocouples going across, and all of our times going down. And of course, from here, it's up to you how you, whatever you want to do with this. If you want to then create different charts based on the spreadsheets, that's up to you. But it's a nice free functional review that I think a lot of customers overlook. And that is pretty much the end of my instructional video. Again, a lot of great features to it. It's really not that difficult. You just need to know how to get to where you want to go in review. So right now, you should be seeing my information pop up on the screen like you have in the rest of the videos. If you have any questions, run into any problems during the instructional video, while I try setting it up on your computer, feel free to give me a call and I can definitely give you a hand. I appreciate your time and have a great day.